So unfortunately, I've been having issues with the sound. Uh, I'm using the camera microphone. I'm sorry if it sounds awful. I wanted to talk to you about an issue regarding, let's say, political philosophy in the practical sense. We've been experiencing a shift in the way we're talking about, let's say, politics now, and I've been pleasantly surprised by a growing trend among conservative Americans to question liberal democracy and its spiritual and philosophical underpinnings. There has been a resurgence and repackaging of old criticisms made by political philosophers that I think have a lot of merit and need to be revisited. I thank and credit popularizers like Orr McIntyre for actually reading and applying thinkers like Carl Schmitt to our current age, something that I believe is very necessary. So Carl Schmitt was a very influential political philosopher and jurist of the 20th century. Perhaps I can show you a little bit of his thought. So Carl Schmitt is credited with the idea of the state of exception. It's a very important political philosophy idea, and it's an idea that inherently criticizes liberalism. It criticizes liberalism, constitutionalism, and parliamentarism. He said that a powerful enough ruler doesn't need to obey rules, but rather he is the arbiter of reality because he's able to transcend rules unilaterally by deciding to establish a state of exception, which is roughly what we call martial law, and therefore violate rules in the name of the greater good. This juridical and political observation that power defines laws and cannot therefore be constrained by laws is now being used by debaters in a modern form to undermine the modern concept of rights within the liberal democratic paradigm, where people simply bandy together and claim entitlements from others through the exercise of sheer political power. And they kind of reify rights as if this was this like divine thing that they can decide is basically reality. So they make politics into a form of religion. So professional debaters like cartoonists made by Jim Bob and Andrew Wilson from The Crucible like to say that rights don't exist because they are invented by politicians through sheer force. Now, this does not mean that all rights are this way. I understand why they want to say that because, for example, we have seen the invention of human rights, which are basically a lie, since there is no one ruler who can rule all of humanity and therefore determine rights for everyone. So that's an inherent problem within, let's say, international law. So going back to what these professional debaters say is, they say that rights are a lie, an empty fabrication to justify force, since they can be taken away arbitrarily. This argument basically states that rights are arbitrary, but the only thing that truly exists are duties, and that rights are therefore redundant. Unfortunately, I don't see how what they say about rights could also apply to duties as well. And they say that they're speaking for Christianity or for Orthodox Christianity. I don't think that this is actually correct. Within this framing that tries to go against the democratic conception of rights, of man giving himself rights, or in some cases man claiming to speak for God, to claim a reality is a certain way, like when Protestants speak about inalienable rights. The problem is that we have the byproduct of also getting rid of justice. We get rid also of the legitimacy of rulers and the embodied aspect of living in a political community. I will explain why. Even before Christ came, jurists would speak about rights as an extension of the will of the ruler. So I will give you now an example within Roman law. Here we have the jurist Sextus Pomponius saying, "At the beginning of our city, the people began their first activities without any fixed law and without any fixed rights. All things were ruled despotically by kings." So here we have an example of the way in which rights come directly from the person of the rulers. So the rulers are the ones that are giving rights. Rights are an extension of the personhood of the rulers. Rights are therefore not a modern invention. Antiquity understood rights to be entitlements granted by the ruler and subject to him, not against him. Now, here we have to introduce a difference between let's say, pagan conception of monarchy and let's say a Christian conception of monarchy. In a pagan conception of monarchy, the king is either a god or a high priest or something in between. And in that manner, the king is a perfect representative of God on earth, and he can rescind rights at his own whim. And this is not the Christian conception of monarchy. A monarch is an image of God, but he's not a perfect image of God, and he's subjected to God. And if he makes a mistake, he's going to have to answer to God. So here we have a very important difference. So some rules might be good, some rules might be bad, but on the whole, and this is what I think is the nuance that is lost, on the whole, rules themselves are meant to be good and to serve justice. And the ruler, being himself subject to God, he is an emissary of God, in the sense that any society that has any rules needs at least some of those rules to be good and to be at least better than not having them. So any tyranny needs to have at least some virtue in its rules, otherwise it would undermine itself and cease to exist. So this is a parallel to how we view virtue within human beings. The image of the ruler from the image of God, has the same parallels as human beings being made in the image of God. They have virtues which we cannot be completely without, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to live. Now, the issue that I see in the formulation of saying that rights are arbitrary or redundant is that it ultimately makes rules themselves arbitrary, and in so doing it separates the image of the ruler from the image of God. And in trying to avoid pure power, it actually ends up back in pure power by presupposing in its framing that a ruler cannot offer rights to then violate them. This I see as a step back, in the sense that it harkens back to the pagan conception of rights, where the ruler is a god and the ultimate source of authority, capable of rescinding rights on a whim, instead of a conception of rights where the ruler himself must guarantee rights despite himself. This framing, which is inherited by the political philosophy that spawned it, is already doomed by its starting presuppositions. It has no difference between a dictator and a king. If a dictator is strong enough to take away your rights, then that's the end of it. So a dictator can make himself king, in a sense. This doesn't understand that there is a sacramental difference between a dictator and a king. And this difference is that the king is sacramentally anointed. This frame fundamentally destroys the difference between power and authority. If you say that a dictator is equal to a king, then power and authority are interchangeable. It gives authority to power inherently, and this is a very big problem, because this, to me, leads to the worship of man, the worship of power. So it's a criticism of pure power that starts by presupposing that pure power is all there is, and then tries to tack on duties as an afterthought, all to maintain a more Platonic vision of justice, which is completely different from the Christian conception of justice. It also has the problem of making rulers and rules into idols, presupposing that they have to be perfect or they're worthless. But a Christian conception of the image knows that God must be the origin and we must conform to God's will. Being strong is not enough. That would be a worship of man. And that's where I see this argument departing from Christianity, in the sense that it starts with a frame where you already have power, and since with power comes responsibility, you, by virtue of being powerful, you're responsible for the rest. So that inherently presupposes that being powerful deserves authority, and that's not a Christian perspective. I understand that they want to go against the worship of man in the form of man deciding what is right by himself. That I completely understand, but we have to use the word rights. Some Bible translations use the word rights, and their whole argument for not using rights is, why use the word rights if it's redundant? We can do without rights. We can just use the word duties, because using the word rights leads to confusion between modern rights and ancient rights and Christian rights, right? So that argument, I think, is flawed. It's just the argument that progressives use against tradition. If you don't see a use for the fence, it doesn't mean that you're allowed to tear it down just because you don't see the use for it. My argument is that rights have an ontological being rooted in God, that they are energies of God. And if they didn't have reality, then there wouldn't be any justice at all. Justice implies society being in right order. It implies rectification and that straightness, that straightening is what the word right means. It's the same for the word derecho in Spanish. Right means straight, derecho means straight. It is a synonym for just, and justice is an energy of God. Our worldly justice participates in God's life in a real way, not a nominal way. It's not that it's a manifestation of the ideal of justice. It is the same thing. They are one. So a healthy society is part of God's being because it is the body of God. To deny rights exist is to say that human laws are arbitrary, that they cannot participate in God, and that rulers are not icons of God. It also means that when we are just, we are not participating in God's love, we're not participating in God's energies, and therefore it's a denial of the incarnational principle that is the core of Orthodox Christianity. This criticism of laws as being arbitrary or pure power inherently alienates laws from being able to image God and to be an extension of the ruler. So this argument perhaps might not satisfy, but I think I'm completely convinced in it. And I have no ill will towards the people who are making the argument against liberalism. I think the criticism is super important, but it's not enough. I wanted to share a couple of things. Like yesterday, I had a small conversation made by Jim Bob. He was gracious enough to allow me to go into his platform and talk a little bit. He's a really great guy, super funny, super talented, super smart, but he didn't let me finish my argument. So after we had our little argument, I wrote a comment on his video saying, you asked for a scenario where we would lose something for not having the concept of rights. Here it is. Without the concept of rights, this is the argument I was presenting, we would lose the legitimacy of authority. Without rights, might makes right, and laws would be arbitrary and reduced to pure power. So laws, both duties and rights, are integral or real parts of society necessary for justice. Rights don't have to be written laws. They are granted by the ruler and are conditional to their goodwill. They are not inalienable, but this doesn't mean they are not real, or else they wouldn't be the standard of justice. Also, they're not simply conditional to the goodwill of the ruler. The ruler cannot unilaterally decide not to give you rights, because that would be going against God. So I was saying that basically his position is that might makes right, and he says your first statement at the gate is wrong. Without the concept of rights, we will lose the legitimacy of force. He says the legitimacy of force can take away rights. No rights, force still exists. Now this is what I claim is pure power. He says without duties, what is legitimacy of force other than the ability to use it effectively and supremely? So you see, force gives you authority, power gives you authority, and that's not a Christian perspective. So I replied to him, the fact that you are saying that actually makes my argument. You are literally saying that force can legitimately take away rights. It implies force can legitimize itself. That's not the case and confuses power and authority, which are distinct. Only legitimate authority can take away rights, not force. With this, you've conceded my argument. Legitimate force comes from God's anointing, not from merely having the power. So I wanted to also share an article written by Jonathan Pageau that is on this topic. So he's talking about authority on the right, power on the left, the way we express this theology in our icons. So this is the right hand of Christ giving a blessing. This is the left hand of Christ carrying the book of life, right? And this comes from Roman art. This is the sign of address, and this is law, the scroll that represents written law. So basically, this whole article is expressing the difference between potestas, which is the power to transform, and authority, auctoritas. So this conception is a, let's say, an ancient conception that we see even in Rome, in Roman society. It's not a Christian invention, but it takes a conception that the Romans had that was fundamentally good, because that is the way that traditional societies thought about the relationship between power and authority. So power did not uh, did not, let's say, um, grant you authority by itself. So anyway, that's what I wanted to say, what I wanted to explore. You can comment on it. You can try to debate it. I'm honestly thankful that these debaters are actually using Carl Schmitt's arguments against liberalism. I think that's a very wise thing to do. But unfortunately, I don't think that those arguments are a good base for our positive vision of what politics should be. So anyway, leave your comments down below. I'll try to reply to them, and thank you for your time. See you.